Welcome to 6 African Trade Talks, the show that brings you closer to the intra-Africa trade business world. I'm your host, Chad Chawanda. In this episode, our guest is Miss Lola Adekanye. Lola is a licensed attorney, a member of the New York State Bar and the Nigerian Bar with more than a decade of experience as a corporate attorney and compliance specialist. Lola, welcome to 6 African Trade Talks. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you for inviting me, Chad.
It's a pleasure. Before we start our show, we'd like to hear a word from our sponsors.
Would you travel to Cape Town for business or leisure? What if you could combine the two? Well, you can. With Optimum African Experience, Cape Town Leisure Experience, with partners such as University of Cape Town, CEDA, Kadena, Luminary, and Prime Focus. Experience the best of Africa.
So tell me, who is Lola Adekanye?
I think you've said a bit about me. I'm an attorney by training, but by calling, I'm a policy advocate for anti-corruption or accountability, integrity, and good governance. I pretty much work in intersection between private sector and public sector, being a program director at the Center for International Private Enterprise. Our work really focuses on empowering the private sector to contribute positively to strengthening democracy around the world. So my experience over the last few years has really been around thinking through how the business community can contribute to reducing corruption. I don't like to say eliminating corruption, but reducing corruption. So that's me. I'm a mom of one. I'm based in Lagos. I'm a Nigerian American. And I'm very happy to be on 6 podcasts for the first time.
Thank you. So tell me something. Lola, what is the one thing nobody knows about you? It could be a turning point or something major that turned the course of your life.
That's a good one that nobody knows about me. I think that this is one that I guess most people already know about me, but I'll share it anyway. I started off thinking I wanted to be a gynecologist. And that changed dramatically when I experienced the first violation of human rights against an elderly gentleman on a road trip one day between a small city of Lokoja and Abuja. I was just in high school trying to decide what to study when I graduate from high school. And all along, I'd been planning to study sciences and become a gynecologist, a medical doctor like my dad. But I experienced that, and that left a very, very strong impression with me. It was sad to watch, and I started to ask, what can I do about this? This kind of injustice shouldn't happen. What can I do? And I was told, well, you can be a lawyer and be an advocate. And that changed the course of my career and in my life very early on, and I've never regretted it. I would probably have been a miserable yet good gynecologist, but I really would have been miserable if I went on to do medicine as opposed to study law and now be doing something that's very, very fulfilling.
Not many people have that chance to really take the direction that they want at an early age in their lives. So that's amazing. You're fortunate to be in that position. Lola, tell us a little bit more about your career journey.
So I started off, of course, I wanted to be a lawyer, and I started off studying law in England and went off to do a master's. But at the time, there's so many specialties, I couldn't decide which one to do. Of course, I had decided on human rights as a young girl, having that experience I had observing the injustice against this poor old man. So I thought I wanted to be a human rights lawyer. I started off doing human rights law. It was new at the time. The EU Directive on Human Rights of 1998 had only just come out at the time. So we were learning about it in 2000, 2001, all the way to 2004 when I graduated. But I started to work with a few law firms and on a few human rights cases. And I realized that they were taking a toll on me because as lawyers know, you should do your job well, but you can't get too attached to your clients. And I found that I could not but be too attached to my cases and my client. And I thought that would make me not the best lawyer. So I had to find another career that's close enough to human rights law where I can have a positive impact on communities and lives and livelihoods of especially the less privileged or least developing countries, but one that would not drain me the way typical human rights cases that I was working on would. So I was introduced to commercial law. I started off with commercial law, then international development, and voila, corruption was one of the major challenges to development and equitable growth for many countries. It was the main reason why, it still is the main reason why there's so much inequality, especially in underdeveloped countries. And I figured, you know what, that's probably your calling. And so I went on from white collar crime. I was working in white collar crime defense for a while, learned about compliance with anti-corruption laws, anti-money laundering, and moved away from the private sector to the development space for good reason. In the private sector, I think I struggled a bit with the ethical dilemma of defending companies when they could have prevented some of the violations that they were involved in. But in the development space, I'm able to empower companies to prevent violations, prevent spillages that causes all kinds of diseases for poor communities, mothers and children in those communities, prevent embezzlement of resources, public or private resources that should really go to building hospitals and helping us cope with the COVID-19 crisis better, or building schools to help improve the HDI, Human Development Index indicators for Africa. Now I can work with partners all around the world to make businesses more responsible. People think corruption is a victimless crime, but it's not. They're victims for these kinds of actions. So really making that case that businesses need to see beyond the short-term benefit really of engaging in corrupt activity. I basically went off from wanting to be a gynecologist like my dad to being a lawyer, and then, realizing human rights law, as much as my heart is there, I don't have the grit to be both professional and passionate at the same time. I'll be more passionate than being professional, and that would not have served my clients right. Now, addressing corruption issues, which intersect with human rights issues very closely, which is true. That's my career journey.
What a journey. And now you are also dealing with quite a huge problem in our continent. So happy to know that people like you are out there and contributing to making Africa a better place for business, for us entrepreneurs and everyone else. Give us an insight into Center for International Private Enterprise. What does the organization do?
Sure. So the Center for International Private Enterprise, for short, we call it CIPE, is a global NGO, really. The CIPE is one of 4 core institutes of the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a congressionally funded NGO headquartered in the United States, in Washington, D.C. The focus and the goal of the NED and CIPE is to strengthen democracies around the world, especially in younger democracies or countries with fairly younger democratic systems. And as one of 4 core institutes that the NED supports, CIPE's specific role is to strengthen a pillar of democracy, which is private enterprise, the private sector. And what we do in that regard is we help the private sector participate actively in making policies, in the governance process, in creating reforms or promoting reforms that ensures fair competition, reduces corruption, and ensures that there is inclusion in the system. And so the focus of our work cuts across, entrepreneurial ecosystem, trade facilitation, women economic empowerment, anti-corruption, accountability and integrity, digital economy, and business leadership. So business leadership to promote trust and build stronger ecosystems for the African economy. And in many of the regions where we work, we currently have programs in between 80 and 100 countries right now. In Africa, we have about 6 country offices. I'm based in Lagos, where we have one of our big offices, and then we have an office in Ethiopia. We're opening one in Kenya and in Mauritania, and we have an office in Sudan. So CIPE's vision is essentially to empower the private sector to promote market-oriented reforms, and the goal is really to strengthen democracies in the country where we work. My particular expertise and focus is on anti-corruption issues. So I lead programs around the business integrity, accountability, and governance currently in about 13 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And as I sit in Lagos, I'm also the country director for the Nigeria programs as well. I'm happy to tell you more about the innovations behind our business integrity project and anti-corruption projects, because it's quite unique. It takes a business-led, a business-centered approach to fighting corruption or addressing corruption issues, as opposed to a law enforcement approach, which would not be effective on its own or even at all in many African countries where there's just a high level of corruption, what we call systemic corruption.
You know, as you're sharing, you brought out a memory. I remember watching a news channel in South Africa, I don't remember which one it was, where there was a gentleman from the Congo. The journalist asked them and said, DRC is very corrupt, right? Your government is very corrupt. And this guy says, I think corruption needs to be looked at from two different angles. Obviously, I don't know what he meant, but he raised an issue that I think, also is aligned to what you are working on, because he says everyone always looks at corruption one way. You must not forget that there is the corrupter and the corruptee. So I'm like, okay.
So, the corrupter and the corruptee, yes.
Yeah, so there's government and private sector. If it's government that is said to be corrupt, there's private sector that has to be ethical. That's just the memory it brought me.
I was just going to tell you that in the anti-corruption industry, we say there's the supply side and the demand side of corruption. There are different patterns of corruption. So for instance, it could be just paying a bribe. In other cases, it could be paying kickbacks, which requires the private sector to what we call pad the budget, which is, you're bidding for a government contract. You say you're going to build a bridge for $5 billion, but it would actually cost you, with a very healthy margin of profit, about $3 billion to do it. But you say $5 billion so that you can compensate the government officials who scales your bid through with the excess. So there's the supply side, you're supplying the bribe as the private sector, and the government is the demand side, you're requiring the private sector to come and collude with you. It reminds me of a Mo Ibrahim quote. Mo Ibrahim, the very famous African philanthropist and entrepreneur, he says, behind every corrupt government official is two businessmen. You're absolutely right. It's very important for us to realize that we can't assume that the public sector alone is in this and they have to fix their systems. We've actually had cases where the public sector says, we're trying to fix our systems, but the businesses keep coming to tell us, oh, but we paid you a bribe last week. Why don't we pay you a bribe to get our license? And so it has to be a whole society approach.
Certainly. And Mo Ibrahim has been very vocal about these issues, especially with government, and his initiative of that award that he gives to the most ethical presidents. So, yeah. How has technology impacted the work that SIPE does, and what role do you see it play in the future in reference to probably public sector accountability?
That's a really good question, and it's like a three-part question. So on the SIPE front, I would say, with most companies around the world, many of them survived because they were able to ramp up their dependence on technological systems just to operate alone. And we've always at SIPE been quite a fairly high-tech organization. Thinking about even more high-tech organizations, I think that's a bit too generous. We've functioned in remote teams for a long time, even before the pandemic. But after the pandemic, I saw that we did rely way more on technology to share resources for security of securing our documents and resources, for connecting with teams around the world, for all kinds of things, operational, and in many ways that we didn't think that we needed to leverage one tool here for accounting or another tool here for having meetings and collaborating via e-channels. We've definitely found that it's improved the way we work. I dare say it's made us a whole lot more efficient, because now we have teams all around the world that are working remotely and being very productive. But before COVID, we pretty much were experimenting with remote teams, and we had a lot of teething problems with that. And now we've had to improve on that. So I see us being quite productive, quite nimble and flexible also in how we can organize our teams and cross-collaborate. I think that In terms of public sector accountability, gosh, technology will go a long way. If we're looking at Africa alone, there's just a lot of untapped opportunity to improve transparency in the public sector. Talk about procurement alone. Just last week, I was meeting with the Bureau of Public Procurement leads from 3 subnational states in Nigeria and from the federal sector. And they were talking about the reforms coming to the procurement processes and systems. And one of them is introducing a one-stop shop platform that has just huge potential. Talk about this in Kenya as well, where the procurement system is going to be feeding on information coming from the Beneficial Ownership Transparency Register shortly, and how that's going to improve transparency so that when businesses bid, they can't hide their true identity of who the beneficial owners of those businesses are. So it helps the procurement officials, it also helps civil society to be more particular about ensuring that there's no conflict of interest. And now they have the information, whereas before they wouldn't have the information because it's tons and tons of files to dig through and cross-reference. But now, if this is all going to be electronic, the business register is also going to be electronic. In Kenya, in Nigeria, it is already electronic. It's saved in the Corporate Affairs Commission. Procurement systems can talk to those systems. Now, we're not yet there, but we're getting there. And then on the SIPE side, SIPE launched a resource, an excellent tool called Ethics First. And Ethics First pretty much helps small businesses that struggle with digitalization, and many went extinct because of that during the COVID. It helps them to now digitize their compliance systems. But not only that, it makes them now more attractive to investors, because when they use Ethics First, they improve their business integrity and business management systems. So they are low risk for corruption. They are low risk for investment to banks and to financial institutions and to multinationals who want to integrate them into their value chain. So just having Ethics First, it's a web platform. It's ethics1st, ethicsfirst.cipe.org. Having Ethics First set up so that every business across Africa, especially the small and mid-sized ones, can log in and build their management systems from scratch, from zero, from nothing, and connect with other businesses and consultants and support there for free, so that they build their brand recognition once they have their management systems in place. It's just an excellent way to improve accountability, really. So I'm very optimistic about the positive aspects of technology and how that can improve accountability, both in the public sector and in the private sector.
And we are blessed here in Africa that the use of technology through mobile penetration is quite high, which is good. So I think we can move faster in that area. So thank you very much for sharing. Before we continue, we'd like to hear a word from our sponsors.
Would you travel to Cape Town for business or leisure? What if you could combine the two? Well, you can. With Optimum African Experience, Cape Town Leisure Experience, with partners such as University of Cape Town, CEDA, Kadena, Luminary, and Prime Focus. Experience the best of Africa.
So Lola, what major role do you think culture is playing or has played in the work that SIPE as an organization is trying to achieve?
That's very broad. So let me narrow it down to 2 areas. One of them is SIPE's traditional partners in many countries are the chambers of commerce and business associations, essentially empowering them to represent the business community effectively and advocate for the right kinds of reforms that they determine that they need. And then another area of work is on the business integrity aspect, which is empowering businesses to mitigate corruption and to band together to protect themselves against retaliatory action where they decide to swim against the tide, really, to say, we'll stick up and not be involved in bribes and that sort of thing. I think that any systems and communities that exist anywhere in the world, there are inherent norms and values and even habits that becomes the prevailing practice in those systems. Now, in supporting chambers of commerce to become more effective, it's really important for SIPE to work with those chambers of commerce to understand what those norms are and help them shape whatever systems they want to shape to achieve the positive outcomes that they want to see. A fantastic example is where in settings where the chambers of commerce maybe operate by collaborating closely with the government, and that has been the way they've operated for a long time. And collaborating with the government, which puts them in a position where they can be compromised and not be effective in representing their members' needs. That's the risk there. The issue there would be where SIPE does not just say, oh, we can't work with this Chamber of Commerce because they don't meet a standard. Rather, it would be more of building capacity, empowering them to understand their role, showing them the models that work and where the challenges are and how to navigate the challenge of potentially being compromised by government agencies or by the government so that they are not effectively representing their members anymore. And in some cases, we've seen successes where, the chambers of commerce eventually realize they need to be independent, and then they build their systems into a more efficient, effective, and independent chamber of commerce that can advocate for their members without risk of being compromised. Similarly, with corruption issues, there's a quote that we often like to point to, which is culture eats strategy for breakfast. And there's a story which might be too long to tell, but essentially you can have the most experienced anti-corruption trainer or expert. If they've lived in a systemically corrupt setting for a long time, there are norms that have become habits. For instance, if they've learned to always give a bribe to get public service and not wait in line, after doing the anti-corruption training, which shows them all the strategies and the risks and the red flags, it takes them deliberately unlearning what has become a habit, what has become a norm, what has become an expectation, so that they can start introducing a new learning pattern, a new behavioral pattern from what they've learned. And that eventually becomes the new culture. So we're very aware that training alone, which is one of the things we do, capacity building and development, is never enough. And that's part of why we set up Ethics First. You can empower companies by providing capacity building, providing resources, ethics policies, HR policies, procurement policies, and showing them how to use it. But there has to be more. We have to shift the incentive structure for those businesses so that those norms that they've learned that tells them that corruption pays, albeit in the short term, we can flip that. So we want to create incentives for businesses to change the way they operate so that when they operate without corruption, they get incentivized, they get recognized, their brand reputation improves, as opposed to when they operate with business as usual, which would usually involve some level of compromise. So with Ethics First, our goal is to drive the cost of operating with integrity down, because right now it's quite steep for some businesses to learn on their own how to implement business integrity systems. But we also want to drive the cost of operating with corruption up, so that when a business rationalizes whether to operate as business as usual, compromising its ethical values, there will be things that would remind the business that this is not the best way to go. This may not be the most profitable way to operate your business. So that's how culture interplays a lot with what we do. And so we're very particular about working with partners, learning from them, hearing their perspectives, and helping them navigate these challenges so that at the end of the day, the outcome is a much stronger, more cohesive business environment.
Culture eats strategy for breakfast. Thank you for sharing. Quickly, what you have been sharing reminds me of doing business in a place like UAE, Dubai.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to get an Emirates ID, or you're trying to get your residence permit, there's a cost. If you're willing to get it quick, you pay, but you're paying the government for a quick service. If you're willing to wait for a long time, you pay a small fee, but you're still paying the government. You don't have to pay anyone. And everything is so electronic that you have what they call the government of the future. I think that's where we need to go as well as Africa. As a traveler, how would you rate the business ethics compliance for SMEs across Africa compared to other countries or continents you have been to? And what are your thoughts moving forward?
So I have to caveat here, first of all, to say, the thing about corruption is that corruption is present everywhere. I think someone once said corruption is not in the DNA of Africa. No, corruption is in the DNA of every human everywhere. And that's also how ethics is in the DNA of every country and every human as well. So it's like the difference between good and evil. It resides in us all. It's just which one do we want to amplify? My theory is this. I think the business ethics compliance for individuals, everybody knows what the right thing is to do. The people who scream and complain the most about corruption may actually be engaging in corruption. It's almost like I don't have responsibility to do anything about it. It's somebody else's responsibility, right? So in the African region, the challenge for businesses is not that SMEs are more corrupt in Africa than in any other country. No, it's more that the systems that should prevent and encourage, incentivize operating without corruption with integrity, or ensure that there are consequences for operating unethically, those systems are very weak. They don't function. Law enforcement would hardly be able to investigate the gazillion number of MSMEs that every day have to pay bribes to get their goods done, get their licenses, or to get to the ports to get their goods. They can't afford to do that. Now, even if they could afford to do that, is it fair for a small business to have to wait 60 days and almost lose their business? You know, when we talk about systemic corruption, I explain to people, systemic corruption to an MSME means survival. They may have to engage in corrupt activity for the business to stay alive. That is when a country is systemically corrupt, or they have to rationalize corruption, and it's easy to rationalize the corruption, where they have to say, whew, I have to travel from Cape Town to Johannesburg to bid for this procurement opportunity and to defend it. I can't just post it there. I'm not likely to get it because I don't know anybody. When they can rationalize corruption, then you have a systemically corrupt problem. So in Africa, our rule of law systems, accountability mechanisms are so weak that people don't believe that they will be caught if they engage in corruption, or they don't believe that they will be rewarded if they don't engage in corruption. And that's the difference between Africa, and not just Africa, countries with systemically corrupt settings in emerging markets especially. And I wouldn't call any countries names, but the poorer countries, you know, you were talking about, you know, in the UAE, how you can pay for expedited service. In Africa, we're unable to generate enough revenue to empower our public sectors to become as efficient as you'll see in the UAE because of corruption. So Africa has a unique problem of corruption to itself. Western countries have a unique problem of corruption as well, but it's a bit more advanced. They are not at the petty corruption level. We are still at the petty systemic corruption level because we have poorer economies. So when the country is not able to generate revenue, they're not able to put it to the basic things of healthcare, access to water, schools, hospitals. They're not able to do that. And that's not the same challenge with more developed countries. There's corruption there, but it's not at that petty level. It's at a different level. It's in the clientele system. It's at a much higher level, but they have the accountability mechanisms funded to be able to continue to make sure consequences follow. For any corrupt activity, consequences follow. So that's kind of the background I'll give. And I'll end with something we always talk about in our community of practice, which is this idea that in any society, you will always have at least 10 to 20% of people who will always be involved in corruption. Any society, a systemically corrupt society like Africa, you have that 20%. In advanced economies, the US, Norway, the least corrupt countries, you always have between that 10 and 20% of people who would always be inclined to compromise systems. Those are the groups of people or organizations, you know, organized criminal groups that law enforcement should be focusing on. The majority of the community, those groups should not be about law enforcement, but should be about the prevention, the culture, the systems that entrench a culture of integrity. It's that group that, you know, you want to apply the Maslow's theory of moral development to, where you say if they rationalize whether they should be involved in corruption or not, before they get to the top of the pyramid, they've already agreed that it's not worth it. Just follow the rules. Because at the top of the pyramid, are the people who, whether the conditions are right or not, they will always do things right with integrity and never compromise. But before you get to that top of the pyramid where there are fewer people, the rationale would be, well, would I get caught? Is everybody doing it? What would people think of me? A bad person or a good person? They have to rationalize their way up to the top. And the systems that a government creates is that system that allows people to answer in the affirmative. Will I get caught? Yes. And then you have people toeing towards operating with integrity more than away from that. In Africa, the systems are not strong enough. And that's why it's easier to rationalize corruption or to even see it as a matter of survival. So I think that's the difference. But we're trying to change that with ethics first and with impressive network of business integrity champions we have called the Africa Business Integrity Network. And I'm sure you'll join me to spread that word.
Certainly, definitely do that. For me, as an entrepreneur, it's easier and it looks much simpler to operate in a country like the UAE, where corruption is very minimum, if at all it can be seen. Why not Africa? UAE is just a country that 60 years ago, it didn't exist. So why not in Africa? How do you see SIPE contributing to the transformation of Africa under the Africa Continental Free Trade Area? In 1 minute.
I see SIPE contributing to the AFCFTA in two ways. One is enabling MSMEs that make up 80 to 90% of the private sector, enabling them to plug into the value and benefits of the AFCFTA. Right now, they are an afterthought. Integration of trade within Africa would be very weak without small and mid-sized and even micro-sized businesses being able to plug into the supply chain that's being developed. And the final thing is integrity. Many of the MSMEs in Africa have operated in systemically corrupt settings for more than 3 decades or more. They don't know any other way to operate without having to face corrupt activities and either choose to operate corruptly or suffer the consequences. And so making sure that MSMEs are able to operate with strong systems of business integrity is another way that we can transform the African continent from its current image.
Thank you. Any podcast or book you would like to share with our listeners?
Yeah, so I'm just reading this book. I haven't finished, but I think it's a good read. Actually, 2 books. One is The Atomic Habit. I think that one would be a good book to read for anyone who's thinking about how to change culture or start personally. So Atomic Habits, it's a good one for everyone. James Clear, that's the author. And the second book I'm reading that I'm starting to enjoy is Uncaptured. It's written by Mosilo Mothepu. She's one of the whistleblowers from the recent South African investigation, the Nenegate and Trillion investigation into the Gupta brothers. Podcasts, I definitely will recommend Democracy That Delivers by SIPE. It's definitely a good one to follow and listen to learn more about SIPE's work, which is quite dynamic in different parts of the world.
Would you travel to Cape Town for business or leisure? What if you could combine the two? Well, you can. With Optimum African Experience, Cape Town Leisure Experience, with partners such as University of Cape Town, CEDA, Kadena, Luminary, and Prime Focus. Experience the best of Africa.
Africa is a continent full of potential, but potential means nothing if we don't take action to create value. Let us take action. Thank you for listening to this episode. Don't forget to post and share this episode on your social media platforms. It will help us reach our mission of sharing knowledge about intra-Africa trade and making it available to as many people as possible. Let us grow our continent. We can go far, fast, together. If you can please leave a review on our podcast page or on Apple Podcasts.